Railroads were taking over the nation.
New industries and businesses were becoming more prominent by the minute.
Oil and steel companies were providing material for businesses and people across sectors.
People like John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie were dominating the country.
The working class was fighting for safer conditions, shorter hours, and better benefits.
New ideas about wages, new ways to fasten processes, and new thoughts about the government and the business world were all arising at once.
Everything was young and up in the air.
What would happen next to America?
I can't take you to heaven. I can't save your soul. I can't promise forever. Hey, yeah, save my soul. Hey, now, whoa, save my soul. Yeah, my.
Hi-ho, hi-ho, it's off to work we go. Hi-ho, hi-ho, we go. There's gold here! Gold! 那听到了吗？下次有精神，我们走吧。
I want it, I got it. I want it, I got it. I want it, I got it. I want it.
While the miners were busy finding gold in California, Americans were migrating west using railroads and building homesteads. But there was a problem. The American Indians owned the land first. Take the baby! Due to the idea of white superiority, Americans would take Indians and force white culture on them.
While everything was going on with the Indians and Americans were forcing them out of their homes and into different places, separating them from their families, and doing all these inhumane acts to them, people either sympathized with them and thought that these were all wrongdoings by Americans, or thought that the Americans were doing the right thing because Indians were savages who needed to be more Americanized. One of the people who thought that Indians were mistreated during this time period in American history was Helen Jackson Hunt. She wrote a book titled Century of Dishonor, and people who read it either completely agreed with her and sympathized with the natives, or believed that what Americans were doing was right.
America has unfairly treated these natives for so long. Jackson's book made me realize just how much wrong they've had to endure since our forefathers came here.
Our ancestors coming here was the best thing that ever happened to those savages. We must finish what they started. We can teach them the way of the holy religion, how to dress and how to act in society.
And continue our cruelty.
It's not cruel if it's for their benefit.
I think you need to look up the definition of cruelty and benefit. Even your pea-sized brain can understand Urban Dictionary.
As American Indians were being taken out of their homes in the Great American Desert so that Americans could settle there, Western settlers were finding new ways to live in a new area. Because the Great Plains had an abundance of cows who would overgraze and eat up the grass, people became cowboys and herded these cows so that families could find a home with adequate land.
When barbed wire was invented, cowboys were no longer necessary because the wire fencing could keep cows out. As a result, a lot of people were moving and building homesteads.
Old MacDonald had a farm, E-I-E-I-O. And on that farm he had some cows, E-I-E-I-O. With a moo-moo here and a moo-moo there, here a moo, there a moo, everywhere a moo-moo. Old MacDonald had a farm, E-I-E-I-O.
Act of 1862 encouraged more Americans to move out and settle west. Through it, the government would give 160 acres of land to everyone who settled in one area for a minimum of 5 years. There is a problem, though. Railroad companies own much of the land out west. Because of this, 5 times the amount of people who got land through the Homestead Act had to purchase it themselves.
Politics in the latter half of the 19th century is a full subject in and of itself. Government leaders were corrupt. They used a system called party patronage that would make it so those who supported the winning candidate would be able to easily get a government job. I feel like I've heard that before.
So pick me. Choose me. Love me.
I pick you! I choose you! I love you! Mariam!
A few moments later.
Economically speaking, America was having a lot of problems. The distribution of wealth was the most unequal it had ever been. People like John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie had hundreds of billions of dollars in today's money, while their workers lived in one-room apartments with 5 others.
Towards the end of the 1800s, in 1893, a large economic crisis occurred. Due to overspeculation, the stock market crashed. For 4 years, railroads were going out of business, unemployment rates were skyrocketing, and farms were going foreclosure. People were so outraged by this economic depression that they took it to Washington, D.C. Dixie's Army was a group of individuals who marched in Washington, D.C. and demanded that the government spend $500,000 to create more jobs.
More money, more jobs! More money, more jobs! More money, more jobs! More money, more jobs!
The Panic of 1893 did not end there, however. It continued for another 2 years.
In addition to the extreme wage gap and the economic depression, debates over currency were developing. People of the Greenback Party favored silver coins and paper money because it was considered easy money. Farmers believed that non-gold currency is better for inflation and would make them wealthier.
The Populist Party, or the People's Party, was created in 1890 by farmers who wanted silver and paper currency, among other things. These people met in 1892 in Omaha, Nebraska to discuss and set their party's political views. There, they also decided that James Weaver was going to represent the Populist Party in the 1982 presidential election.
Today, I, James Weaver, am both overjoyed and humbled to announce that I will be running for president in this year's election as a populist. When I win, I will work to pass a law making it so that senators are chosen under popular vote, citizens vote for proposed laws, workers will have only an 8-hour workday, and railroads are owned by the United States government.
On election day, 11.5 million men went to the polls and voted. At the time, Republican Benjamin Harrison was the president, but he did not win a second term. Instead, Democrat Grover Cleveland was elected and became the first and only president to be elected in 2 non-consecutive terms. Fast forward 4 years, William Jennings Bryan and William McKinley were competing against each other to become president. McKinley was a Republican who supported big business and higher taxes, while Bryan was a Democrat who believed that silver shouldn't be a major currency and that the government should not be a business. Bryan was especially famous for delivering his Cross of Gold speech to the Democratic Convention.
Neighbors, I'm standing before you to explain and ensure you understand the significance of gold currency in our beloved country. As of now, wealthy businessmen are running the government, and therefore, us, of the working class, are not receiving the care that we should from the White House. Remember, my friends, that this care would be lessened if my opponent, Mr. McKinley, came into office. These ideas that the Republicans have of supporting gold and big businesses do not help us, and they do not advance America. I tell you, do not let these ideals stop you from succeeding. Let's fight against them. Silver forever!
As famous as Bryan was, and as much as he toured the country to campaign, it was not enough to win presidency. McKinley ended up receiving both the popular votes and winning the vote of the Electoral College, making him the 25th President of the United States. Although railroads were used by many people and all sorts of businesses, Many individuals and groups had problems with the high fee. These people began the Grange movement. They took their thoughts to the government, and later, in the 1860s, Congress passed Granger laws that regulated railroad fees.
New Granger laws passed.
Others were annoyed with private industries controlling the country. The court case, Munn versus Illinois, decided that the government could regulate these companies. Another important court case relating to the regulation of railroads is APUSH versus Illinois. Here, the Supreme Court ruled that a single state cannot control an interstate railroad because it runs through multiple states. This led to the Interstate Commerce Commission that set up groups to investigate railroads and ensure that they are following all the laws.
In 1890, the western frontier was closed, meaning that there was no more undiscovered land in the west that wasn't settled.
We have discovered and seen everything this fine land has to offer. Because of this, I have decided to shut down the frontier. We will no longer be sending groups to explore the vast land.
A historian named Frederick Jackson Turner was known for writing the Frontier Thesis.
You can't do this! The frontier has drastically changed American culture. Without it, we would not be independent and individualized people. The frontier broke down social classes and therefore furthered this economy. How can you do this?
John Muir was a preservationist. Preservationists were people who believed humans were harmful to natural resources and wanted to take these resources away from the people.
Preservationism stemmed out of conservationism. Conservationists were frightened by deforestation and believed in saving and managing natural resources. They wanted to convince the government to save nature. A tactic they used was they took beautiful pictures of forests and other parts of nature to show the government what America would lose if it did not try to stop humans from destroying it. Congress eventually created national parks, like Yellowstone Park, to ensure these areas would never be damaged by humans.
The Gilded Age gives us the ability to vacation to national parks, but that's not the only part of America that goes all the way back to the 19th century.
Throughout this period, immigrants were flooding into the United States from countries across the Atlantic. When they reached the United States, they were welcomed by a beacon of the freedom they would supposedly have when they settled. The Statue of Liberty stood at the entrance of the country just before the ships would reach Ellis Island, where every immigrant would come before they could enter the country.
About 4 years before the statue was built, however, Congress had begun passing laws that restricted immigration. The Chinese Exclusion Act was a law that placed a ban on immigrants coming from China. Many American workers were concerned with the Chinese because they saw them as competition when it came to finding jobs. The idea of racial purity also influenced Congress when passing this law.
As cities became more industrialized, they also became more urbanized. This was because many Americans were searching for new economic opportunities in a city. Many people left their jobs on farms in order to work commercial jobs. In urban politics, groups known as political machines controlled the political parties in major cities. The leaders of these organizations knew how to manage the ethnic, social, and economic groups.
One of the most prominent parts of this time period was known as segregation. By the end of Reconstruction, Democratic politicians known as Redeemers came into power. They preferred a policy of separating public facilities for blacks and whites.
The idea of segregation came to be due to a court case known as Plessy versus Ferguson. In this case, the Supreme Court decided that the idea of separate but equal facilities for whites and blacks was constitutional and therefore did not violate the 14th Amendment. And after that decision, a series of segregation laws, or Jim Crow laws, were adopted by the southern states.
Defendant, any final remarks?
Yes, I would like everyone to know that everything is separate but equal.
Plaintiff, do you have any closing remarks?
I disagree with the defendant. Although he claims the train cars were equal, they in fact were not. And my client only sat in the whites-only train car because he had nowhere else to sit. So, separate but equal is not in fact equal.
I'm going with the defendant's opinion on this case. I believe that separate but equal treatment is okay. This court is adjourned.
Before reform movements like the African American Civil Rights Movement that had begun back in 1820 and around that time were starting to pick up around 1880 and 1890. W.E.B. Du Bois was an African American civil rights advocate. Towards the end of the 1800s and beginning of the 1900s, he became one of the leaders of this movement. Du Bois was very knowledgeable about this topic. He wrote many books about it, and through them and through his advocacy, he encouraged others to join the fight for freedom.
Americans deserve rights, equality, equality, equality for all. African Americans deserve rights, equality, equality, equality for all.
Another major reform movement that was going on in the late 1800s and beginning of the 1900s was something known as the settlement movement. This movement encouraged people from both rich households and poor households to come together and unite as one people. One of the ways people could do this was through the settlement house. The settlement house was a place where people would come together for educational, recreational, and other purposes.